Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everybody, and welcome to Pangolin, the Conservation Podcast. The show dedicated to exploring and amplifying the world's underappreciated conservation stories. The stories that inspire me, and I hope will inspire you too. I'm your host, Jack Baker, and today I am joined by the absolutely brilliant Gerry Ellis, who, among other things, is a fantastic wildlife photographer whose work has been featured in National Geographic, the founder of GLOBIO, a non-profit which helps create environmental films and provides training and support for other conservation organisations on how they can share their story, and a podcast host. So if you're into everything that I do, go and check out Talking Apes, because it's also incredibly fantastic and brilliant and wonderful and interesting and, yeah, different to this show, but still incredibly wonderfully conservation focused and interesting for all of you ape and primate nuts out there. Go and check it out, it's brilliant. Now, as some of you may know, this series we are celebrating all things Africa, and with his wealth of experience, Gerry comes well equipped to help us do just that. We start with a chat about his early career and how he came to fall in love with the great apes. We then move on to chat about the great apes in the age of the Anthropocene, and so we talk about their struggles and stories and how we can make a difference on their lives. And it gets deep, it gets emotional, and it does touch on some sensitive topics, but I think it's really interesting, and I think you guys will really, really appreciate it. We also talk about his time working with Dr Jane Goodall, his love for the nature around him, and why he keeps coming back to apes as the focus of his work. It's so interesting, I'm so excited, so without further ado, let's get started. And welcome back to the show. I am now joined by Gerry Ellis, who is an award-winning environmental photographer, filmmaker, podcast host, and, on top of all that, founder and director of international awareness-raising charity GLOBIO. So thank you so much for joining me today, Gerry. We have so much to talk about. So yeah, thank you for making the time to be here.
Thanks, Jack. This is really great. Looking forward to it. And yeah, we do have a lot to talk about.
Yes. And just some context for the listeners. So I have already appeared. I think the episode should be out by the time I release this one. I've appeared on Gerry's podcast. We also have presented together or on the same stage at a conference last year. So we've kind of had these fleeting moments of interaction, but I've actually not had a chance to sit down really and ask you. You've asked me questions and I've never had a chance to ask you. So I'm quite excited today to kind of get to talk about your work. So thank you so much for being here.
Happy to flip the microphones the other way, and now you can drill me with all those hard questions I drilled you with.
Yeah. Just this is what it is. I've actually all the questions I sent you as prep were just to fool you into a false sense of security, and I've got mastermind level questions here now, just really tough ones. But no. I guess I gave you an introduction there, but like I always like to first thing to do is kind of hand the microphone over, as you say, and say like, well, I introduced you briefly. I gave quite a long list of achievements there, but like I think it's always best to let you introduce yourself. So, what should the listeners know? Yeah, just to get them a little bit of a sense of who you are and what you do.
Well, I guess at the heart, I'm a curious 8-year-old little boy. And so I've spent my and I keep saying to everyone, someday I'll grow up and put my shoes away and quit running around the planet doing things. I hope that never ends, actually. But I guess on a more serious note, I was at university a few decades ago and studying to be coral reef ecology is what I wanted to do, actually, and doing underwater photography, and then took a sort of a right-hand turn and started pursuing becoming a photographer, and thinking to be an underwater photographer. And that was at the time not a lucrative enough career to sustain life, my life. And so I started photographing a lot of other things, and I've always just been curious about nature and wildlife in general, and was fortunate enough to end up doing a series of trips. The first one, I went and lived it for 5 years in Australia and Papua New Guinea, filming and doing a couple of books, and lived with some indigenous people in Papua New Guinea, and that was amazing. And ended up with a body of work coming out of that whole Austral, Papua New Guinea region that other people in the world didn't have. So I was started publishing quite a bit in Europe and the United States and other places, and kind of put my name on the map. And so I took that newfound fame and ran off to the Amazon for a year, and then ended up in Africa, and fell in love with Africa. So spent the bulk of the next couple of decades in Africa, and that's when I was invited by a friend who was a PhD student under Jane Goodall to come to Gombe and film chimpanzees. And Jane said,
Mhm.
"Sure, come on down." And uh, it was like, yeah, looking back on it, it was one of those things that you just go, "Oh my God, this is like the chance of a lifetime." But at that time, I was thinking, okay, it's just let's go photograph chimps. I'd been photographing cheetahs and elephants and everything else, and it didn't seem that miraculous to me to be in Gombe and photographing. Looking back on it, I wish I'd spent half my time filming Jane, because there was the real story. And in a way, that influenced the rest of my career, because I realized that the people are as much the story as the animals. And
Mhm.
I think you know that very much in many of the guests that you've had on this podcast, and talking about the conservation of life in general. It's very much a people story as much as it
Mhm.
is a wildlife or natural history story. And so I was photographing chimps. I made three trips to Gombe filming, and then at one point Jane said to me, you should get up to Karasoke in the Virunga Mountains of Rwanda, on the border of Rwanda, and at the time it was called Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. She said that's Diane had been murdered. Dian Fossey had been murdered, and she said, "I don't think those gorillas will be there 5 years from now. There's nobody there to protect them."
Mhm.
And at the time, we only thought that there was about 230 to 250 mountain gorillas in the world. And so I jumped on a jumped on a boat across Lake Tanganyika to Bujumbura, and then overland through Rwanda, and just went up to the Virungas and pitched up, and there was nobody there, and nobody there taking. There was one research student from Holland that was there, and he wasn't even there when I got there. Actually, I got a bunch of porters, and almost your classic safari experience, right? I hired 15 porters to carry all my stuff and food for a month. Went up to Karasoke, got to camp. No, I didn't pay any fees. There was no park ranger there to say yes, no, anything, right? Um, Really an amazing opportunity. And I got there, and there was supposed to be this guy, Harold Peters, and I said, "Where is Harold?" And they all said, "Well, he left the mountain 2 days ago. We think he's in down in the village getting drunk." And so I walked back down the mountain, which is not easy. It's a couple-hour trek. I walked back down the
Mhm.
mountain. Anyway, I found him. He was in this little shanty bar, and he was getting drunk. He had been on the mountain for months without seeing anyone else, and just said, "Screw it.
Mhm.
I'm getting off this mountain." And he went down, was drinking the local brew, and was really so. Eventually, he and I walked back up the mountain with a few folks to guide the way, and then I went to work photographing mountain gorillas, and then made multiple trips up until about 1994, when the genocide hit.
Mhm.
And I had left the country a couple months before that. And um, so, anyway, long story short, great apes became a real focus for everything I did. But the genocide in Rwanda really put me off from that part of the world. So I was kind of based out of Nairobi, Kenya at the time, and I went back over. And so in the late 1990s, I just decided to focus on African elephants. And
Mhm.
but like I said, I was interested in this confluence between what people do and what what wildlife what's happening to wildlife. And I ended up at the Sheldrick's orphanage just outside of Nairobi, which is an
Mm-hmm.
elephant rhino. They were rescuing principally elephants. And at the time, they were a couple baby elephants, and I talked to Daphne Sheldrick, who is now has passed, but she at the time she agreed to let me come there every day and not pay these exorbitant, well, they're not exorbitant, they're justified filming fees, but I couldn't afford
Mm-hmm.
that. And
Yeah.
she said, yeah, and so basically for the next 4 years, I came and went from the late 90s to 2000 ish, and did a project called Wild Orphans, which was a short film and a book, and then became about 90 major magazine pieces around the world,
Mm-hmm.
and is now since become a National Geographic kids book and some other things. But it was about these orphan baby elephants. And so that really launched a whole different direction of my life, which is why we're talking. Which is
Mm-hmm.
I launched a organization called GLOBIO, a charity, a nonprofit
Mm-hmm.
here in the United States, and it stands for it. The long name was originally the Global Biodiversity Education for Children, because I some incidents that happened with these baby elephants and watching children react to them, and I thought we really need to somehow get the next generation engaged in conservation and thinking about their role, because it was clear that their role outweighed what we adults were doing.
Mm-hmm.
The adults were having the impact, but the kids had the opportunity to influence and negate some of that impact. And so Globio was sort of we took that big long thing and we made it something kids could say,
Yep.
which is Globio. And
Mm-hmm.
Globio is, it's GLOBIO. And if people want to look it up, it's GLOBIO.org.
Mm-hmm.
And then fast forward, basically, here we are 20 years later, and we've really sort of focused on great apes,
Mm-hmm.
as these, as they love to say in the biology business, charismatic megavertebrates. These big things that we all relate to, connect to, and instantly recognize. And then under that umbrella, we've got an Apes Like Us YouTube channel. We've got a Talking Apes podcast,
Mm-hmm.
and we've got a film division. And within that film division, we do workshops and mentoring our local partners across the globe, um, in how to do local filming and podcasting and all those kinds of things. So it's a very it sounded long, but it's actually the short version of who I am and how I got here as a filmmaker, basically a communicator, using whatever tools are necessary to try to create awareness and understanding about what's happening to species and the places on this planet.
Mm, yeah, and it's a fantastic story, and it's like, yeah, it's one of those stories that I was like, I can't interrupt, but I have so many questions, and there's a whole other podcast where I just go back and like re-listen to that, and then come back and go, okay, now I have 100 more questions for you after this, all about those ones. But no, it's such an interesting story, and it's like to be able to have worked in the place like with and some like with names of people like icons of the conservation space, and like being right there of like having the fact you can say, oh, I was speaking to Jane, and like it's there's so many amazing moments in those stories that like you just it must have been absolutely surreal to do like to
Looking,
live it.
yeah,
Yeah.
looking back on it is they're yeah, looking back on it, it has been a charmed life, and
Uh-huh.
especially for somebody who wasn't a primatologist. I mean,
Yeah.
somebody who wasn't, I didn't study conservation science. I didn't study behavioral anthropology. I wish I had now looking back on it, because that's where I probably should have been directed. Um,
Mhm.
but I grew up scuba diving in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, on the border of in Washington State and British Columbia, Canada. And so I was, sailing sailboats and diving, and then when I went off to Australia, like I mentioned earlier, I spent months on the Great Barrier Reef and doing stuff. So being underwater was always I thought was my destiny,
Hmm.
and then it kind of shifted gears, and I ended up, spending a huge chunk of my life in Africa, and I'm still there a lot, and in Borneo, Sumatra, with orangutans. And then oddly, in the off season of that, which is, sort of December, January, I was in Antarctica. So I made I think 40 crossings of the Drake Passage to Antarctica, guiding ecotourism, guiding ships down there, filming. So really familiar with Antarctica, especially the Antarctic Peninsula and life there. So, which is complete contrast to, working in the tropics of equatorial Africa or Borneo. So,
Hmm. I was gonna say I'm so glad that this series is themed Africa. Otherwise, I would just like there's now 100 more questions popped out. I have to stick to Africa themed ish topics. We have to to circle at least around them. Uh, and I guess like the first kind of or the main kind of question like I had kind of thinking about that kind of experience and like looking back on it, like what was it about that like so obviously like you started with apes and then you kind of drifted away but then you've come back again to kind of working with apes again. What was it about the apes that kind of pulled you back to them? Like what was the experience? What was there just something that they left like this impression that you couldn't shake, or what was it that
well, it was definitely.
Mhm.
I mean, they're going back to that, CMVs, charismatic megavertebrates. They're very charismatic, and they look like us. And you know, part of the reason that we have focused Globio and all the efforts we do around, talking apes and apes like us, is because one of the difficulties, as you are well aware, in conservation is the hurdle. I think one of the things that's so
Mhm.
wonderful about your podcast, Pangolin, is that you're looking at these smaller creatures, these untold
Mhm.
stories that we don't often think about in conservation. And we were trying to one of the things that I guess has become important to me over the course of the last few decades in trying to do conservation in a different way. I mean, we're not a big, what I call, corporate conservation organization. We're not,
Mhm.
we don't need to go through all the names, but there are enough of those on the planet, and
Mhm.
they're very top heavy, in my opinion. I've worked for many of them as a filmmaker and photographer, and they the people on the ground are busting their tails to do the work, but there's
Mhm.
also this massive structure overhead. And sometimes I think making progress gets lost in the mechanism. And
Mhm.
one of the things that's I think beautiful about the small conservation organizations that are, especially that are on the ground doing the hands-on work, is
Mhm.
they have a chance to really, the saying, where the rubber hits the road, they really impact what's happening on a daily basis. So we look, you know, I look at it, and we as the organization look at it as like, how can we not come in and put in a new structure, come in and throw millions of dollars and say, no, you need to do it this way. This is the latest research that says you should be this kind of conservation organization. But go in and spend more time asking questions. It's like, how do you need us within the niche that we are, which is a communication, really? We're really
Mhm.
a nonprofit communication organization, creative communication organization. How can we help you communicate better what you do to
Mhm.
locally, nationally, and to the world? And how can we also help build capacity so that you can communicate yourselves? Because I'm over these years of being in all these amazing places, and it's been a great privilege. It's like
Mhm.
I cannot tell you, you know, people can't see this, but they might have guessed. I'm a white male, and
Mhm.
being a white male over the last 40, 50 years on this planet has been an incredibly privileged place to be. And I'm totally aware of that. I have gotten to do so many things that if even if I was just a white female, I wouldn't have gotten to do. It would have been harder, at least. Um, and so I feel like there's an obligation to as we look around the world of conservation and species conservation, is like not bring our white lens to it all the time, but understand that
Mhm.
we do look through a white lens. And
Mhm.
so if I'm aware of that, then how do I help? I'm saying I, but I mean the organization. How do we help focus your lens, help you see through your lens to what we're trying to do? Because if you're
Mhm.
sitting in Cameroon or Sierra Leone or the Congo Basin or Borneo, you have a much better idea of what you need to create a change in the conservation landscape
Mhm.
around you than I do.
Yeah.
But as an organization, we have all these skills. We have filmmaking skills. We know how to tell stories. We know how to record podcasts. We know how to do all those things. So if we can come and work with you to tell those stories and in the process build your capacity to tell your own stories, that authentic storytelling can have a huge impact in your local conservation dynamic, in your local and influence your local conservation landscape. And so that's become critically important to us as an organization, and what we try to do. And again, I've been really privileged to be able to see all these things myself. And I mean, I saw, I've seen all these great apes, for example, and many other smaller
Mhm.
primates in the wild long before I saw them in sanctuaries, or which is what dominates a lot of the work we do now. We're connected to different rescue sanctuaries and conservation projects around the world, which are our partners on the ground. But my first impact was seeing them. I mean, going to Gombe and seeing chimps, and then going to the Virungas and
Mhm.
sitting with mountain gorillas. Back then, before we realized the disease issues and all those, and also the others, I sat for hours, a meter, 2 meters away from mountain gorillas, and just watched them and filmed
Mhm.
them being themselves, you know?
Mhm.
And when you sit there for 5, 6 hours at a stretch, or longer some days, and some days you sit there for 5, 6 hours, and I would sit there in the rain, never filming anything. They sat in the rain, I sat in the rain, and we all just sat in the rain. But and then, ending up going to that, influencing me to wanna see the other great apes. So I went to Borneo
Mhm.
and spent, months and months in the forests of Borneo seeing wild ones, long before I ever saw these rescued ones. So, that's what influenced a lot of my thinking about apes. But it was really the genocide in Rwanda that turned the tables for me, because I realized that I'd been sitting up in those mountains off and on for 4 years,
Mhm.
completely oblivious to the what was happening with humans around me.
Mhm.
Really, it was on the so far on the periphery, and yet underneath it was like a volcano boiling up, ready to
Mhm.
explode. And then I left, and a couple months after I left on one occasion, I meant to go back, but a couple months later, the genocide occurred, and in 100 days, nearly 1 million people were murdered. And the impact of that has continued to this day. I mean, as we're talking right now, early in 2023, it's renewed fighting in eastern Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, an area that has been the deadliest place on earth for human beings and
Mhm.
other species. But let's just look at humans for a moment. It's the deadliest place on earth since World War II. More people have died than anywhere else on the planet. And it's one of the, and yet, if you were going to say, I'm going to set aside a piece of land for conservation to protect great ape species, gorillas, eastern lowland gorillas, bonobos, chimpanzees, eastern Congo would be it. And yet it's rife with it's on a roller coaster. And I mean, if you look at decade after decade over the last, 5, 6 decades, it's just been a roller coaster of civil war, civil unrest, um, fleeing, Ebola outbreaks. It just it's just constant, you know. And
Mhm.
so the groups that are in there, and some of them we work with, and are closely connected to, like Grace and the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund and IGCP and others. I mean, it's what a nightmare to work in these conservation areas.
Mhm.
And as you know, in these are again being these charismatic mega species, they
Mhm.
they're at the top.
Yeah.
Below them, they're influencing thousands of other species, everything from okapis to pangolins to bush babies to chameleons that no one ever sees to all kinds of bird life and other things.
Yeah, it's one of those ones that it's we've talked about on the podcast before with various examples, such as when with Madagascar with the famine that went on, and I believe probably is still ongoing in some areas. We were when we recorded that series a couple of years ago, and like there are always these human elements that impact conservation, and don't just impact conservation on a kind of light, oh well, someone didn't want to go to work today, so like that's not the human type of element we're talking deeply rooted human issues that impact wildlife in so many ways. And I think it's so interesting, especially to hear, like it's an important conversation to have, because I think, yeah, growing up and all of these growing up for me personally, and I think a lot of people have this perception of conservation that it is very much an animal centric or a nature centric issue, and that if we change the people around, or we have to like we really have to focus on wildlife and put up walls and do all this sort of, and like make it very much like animals versus wildlife, animals versus people or something type dynamics. And actually no, the human issues and wars and genocides and famines and all of these things, we're all part of this same cycle, and all of this affects one another. And so it's interesting to hear from you and your perspective on being right there in the kind of sit caught up right in the center, the eye of that kind of storm and that hurricane. It's, yeah, really an interesting story to hear.
Well, I've cut two things popped to mind as you were
Hmm.
talking. One is I remember standing in Madagascar. I was in sort of the central mountains.
Hmm.
Um, I think maybe my first trip to there, which was many years ago,
Hmm.
and the guide that um, I had him pull over because I wanted to film this landscape that I was looking down upon, and I
Hmm.
stood there absolutely stunned that I
Hmm.
was looking at a landscape that rolled off fairly steep hills that
Hmm.
just went off into the distance, all terraced for
Yeah.
rice production. That all used to be rainforest. It was now all kind of arid, terraced. But what shocked me was I stood there and I went, "My God, this was done with people with shovels and hoes and rakes." This was
Hmm.
human industry that completely transformed a landscape. This was not done by big industrial tools. This wasn't the industrial, agriculture that, when we talk about palm oil plantations where they come in and it's just bulldoze down chunks of rainforest and chainsaw everything out and then burn it, the peat to the ground and,
Hmm.
come in and plant thousands and thousands of, palm oil trees like corn crop. This was done over 1,000 years by human hands, just
Hmm.
handfuls of dirt and rakes and hoes, and I was just absolutely stunned, and it was the first time, I think, in my life where I really was both shocked and in awe of human industry. Our our ability to do that, and that's such a recent thing. I mean, it's really only we talk about being in the Anthropocene now,
Hmm.
currently, and there's continued debate as to when it actually started, and there's a fairly strong argument. I think Simon Lewis, in the UK, puts forward that 1610 or something should be the time that we actually talk about that, and that's sort of right before the industrial age starts, and the reason being quickly is there's a if you look at ice deposits and sediments, there's a dip in the carbon cycle about that point.
Hmm.
And what happened was there was um, the push into the Americas by Europeans brought with it a virus, smallpox, and and in a short period of time, decade or so, 50 million people around the planet died, and many of those were in the Americas. What happened was agriculture crashed across
Mm-hmm.
and those landscapes were repopulated by forests. Those forests drew carbon out of the atmosphere and pulled down the carbon levels. You can see that spike. It's often in looking at epochs. You call it a golden spike. Um, they call it, I think for this they've labeled it the golden orbis or something, but it's this spike where you see it and you realize that was when there was a shift. And so some people have
Mm-hmm.
said that around 1610 should be the marker from start at which we start the Anthropocene going forward. But in
Mm-hmm.
some ways you could almost look back to about 10,500 years ago, and that's when humans started. It was by hand, but it was industrial agriculture and domestication of livestock. That really shifted who we are on this planet. And so for the last 10,000 years, we've just been accelerating that and have become this dominant species that now, for the first time, influences landscapes, influences species in a way in which we had never occurred before that. Because
Mm-hmm.
what we're doing now is, prior to that, meteorites crashing into the planet, volcanic eruptions that influenced, the atmosphere over the entire globe, plate tectonics, earthquake, those kinds of things. Those were what shifted climate. Those were what shifted the direction of the planet. But they were spikes that influenced it, and then things adapted. What's been going on for the last 10,000 years is that we've actually postponed the next ice age because of global warming happening. The cooling on this planet should have started occurring, and we've already postponed that. We have actually, human beings have actually moved. I mean, we're talking about conservation and how it stretches beyond species. Think about, I read this fact because we've got somebody coming on our podcast to talk about the Anthropocene. And I was doing some research, and this one blew me away. It was going back to Madagascar and moving that landscape. Humans have moved more soil and more sediment on this planet than all natural processes. And you say, "What?" But just think about the the truckloads of sand that are moved around the planet to create glass in drinking glasses, windows in skyscrapers, whatever it happens to be, right? The sand that has been moved around the planet. We have created, from sediments, we have created enough concrete to encase this planet in a 2 millimeter thick concrete shell.
That's horrifying.
Yeah.
That's yeah. That is like it's one of those facts that it's. I sound like I'm laughing, but it's like one of those shocked like that can't be true. That's like genuinely horrifying. That's yeah.
Yeah. And the impact is that it's reduced it's reduced this other life on the planet,
Hmm.
from a conservation standpoint. And it's like, if you take all of the major mammals on the planet, that makes up about 3% of the mass. Humans make up 30% of the mass.
Hmm.
The other 67% is made up of the animals that we grow to feed ourselves. 67%. That did not exist before 10,000 years ago.
Hmm.
And as a
Hmm.
result, we've taken down half. There were about estimated 6 trillion trees on this planet. We've cleared 3 trillion of them off the planet
Hmm.
to grow those animals. So it's not just killing species. It's not just poaching a pangolin. It's not just
Hmm.
poaching a chimpanzee for bushmeat. It's There are these bigger sort of systems changes that we are influencing in this period called the Anthropocene. And so, as a species, what's so fascinating, and that's part of the reason that we named our program areas Apes Like Us, and
Mm-hmm.
talking apes is because we are not only influencing our moment in time, the present, but we're the only species and the only time which we're actually influencing the future. A volcano
Mm-hmm.
goes off and it influences the future of the planet's atmosphere for, you know, a year, maybe. If it was really catastrophic, it's a Krakatoa going off, kind of thing. Um, but we're talking about influencing things that will have impacts 10, 20, 50, 100, 200, 1,000 years into the future. No other
Mm-hmm.
species has done that. And that's where I find us really amazing. Apes like us being
Mm-hmm.
and the only way, I mean, one of the strongest ways to me to talk about that is why apes is because apes look so much like us.
Mm-hmm.
We can kind of get past the hurdle of familiarity.
Yeah.
As you well know, trying to get somebody to love these small creatures is tough because they look so alien to us.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
trying to, influence people's thinking about them, if they look at a pangolin and they think it's cute, they're hooked. But if they look at a pangolin and they think that thing is scary, dragony, snake-like thing with
Yep.
scales, don't get that thing near me, and
Mm-hmm.
they see that big tongue come whipping out trying to get termites. You're just like, ugh, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, screw pangolins. You're not going to ever get pangolins to be their animal of choice to understand conservation.
Yeah.
So but there are not a lot of people that look at a chimp or a gorilla or orangutan or bonobo and go, I don't get it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. There's that familiarity, and when you see them caring for their young and you see them like it feels like, yeah, it's that you can put your personality or people you know's personality or into these animals, and like it's a big debate that people have, I think, a lot of the time, especially when working in zoos and around zoos, of like how much personality should you give an animal and how much of a personified character should you give an animal. But with apes and things like that, it is easy to do because they are right there. They're kind of, they have the face like us, they have the reactions like us, or what we would perceive to be like us. And so it's a really easy and kind of interesting one to kind of to focus on, I think. And it's yeah, it's an interesting kind of gateway, I guess, as well, with the kind of five of them, if you include us, being the umbrella species for so many other things that exist round about them. It's so interesting, and a really, I think, a good take, because it's pretty much the opposite of mine. Is that I go for small and little and weird and try and get people to focus on the little things and then kind of hook their curiosity that way. And then you go with the familiar, and it's interesting to see how both of those kind of tools tools work. I guess it prompted like the whole Anthropocene discussion really prompted like so many thoughts in my head about questions that I could ask. And I think, like, from your experience, kind of, we kind of talked about the Anthropocene as it affects one of the great apes, us, and our perception of it. But I suppose, looking at the others, particularly, I guess, the ones in Africa, if we're, but I'm, this conversation is so interesting. I don't use any example really, but like, like, what is the, from your kind of view and having spoken to everybody you've spoken to and been everywhere you've been, what is the experience of apes in the Anthropocene, great apes in the Anthropocene? Is it like, what is that picture like for them more specifically?
Well, it's a desperate one. If we look at it on the surface, their numbers are plummeting, and that's all. The interesting thing, I'll share a quote that was given to me by someone. I was doing some work in the Congo, and he said that there's a saying, canaries in the coal mine. I don't know,
Mhm.
how
Yes.
many of your listeners are familiar with that, but basically coal miners used to take canaries in a cage down into the coal mine, and if the canary started having quit singing and started having issues, then maybe there was something wrong with the air, and maybe you need to think about getting the hell out of the coal mine in a hurry. And especially if the canary dropped over dead, that might be a real good sign that you should get out of
Yep.
there. So that idea of canaries in the coal mine as a signal for, things that are going wrong, especially environmentally, is. And he said to me, I said, apes are our global canaries in the coal mine. What happens to them will happen to us. And again, going back to that apes like us, we, they need all the same resources we need to exist on this planet. If you look at where, and this is part of the reason for us to focus on great apes, not only do they look like us, so you kind of get over that hurdle immediately and can move on to other issues about conservation and survival more quickly, I feel like. But also, they live, if you take the four non-human great apes, and they live across Borneo, Sumatra, in the tropics. They're all around the equatorial band. They live in Borneo, Sumatra, and they live across the Congo Basin, basically from the Virungas in Central Africa and Uganda across to West Africa, Ivory Coast.
Mhm.
If you look at that area, that also is about 3 of the 8 billion people that live on this planet.
Mhm.
3 of the 8 billion. That's 40% of all the people that live on this planet. And the vast majority of those people make less than $3 a day. Many of them less than $1 a day. So
Mhm.
you're talking about people who are, by global standards, in deep poverty, and their only access to resources is the same place that these apes that we're talking about have access to resources. So they're slash and burn, cutting into rainforests that surround them. They're bushmeat hunting. They're digging deeper and deeper into the forest for minerals that they can, like coltan, tin, gold, um, tantalum, whatever, that they can then sell in a market. They're they're burning trees in piles to create charcoal so that they can cook and heat their homes. So their impact is huge. And so going back to that, these apes are the canaries in the global coal mine. Really, what's happening to them is happening to us. In a place like the Congo Basin, you're really looking at the second largest lung on this planet. If the Amazon is, if you took a look down at the planet and you spin the globe, and on your left hand side you have the Amazon basin, and across the Atlantic you have the Congo Basin. Think about it, those are the two lungs of this planet, the two great rainforests that are left. What it, what we're doing is, like, we're like cutting out chunks of our the lungs on this planet.
Mhm.
Those those are also the places where all these primates live. So they really are indicators. They are the canaries that are saying to us, look what you're doing to us. I mean, great apes in across equatorial Africa have plummeted in the last 100 years from well over 1 million in total to now just a few 100,000. And we
Mhm.
don't even, the sad part is, we don't even know exactly. We,
Mhm.
we don't know, except for something like a mountain gorilla, which is living in such a tiny little island in the
Mhm.
sky, that we can actually do censusing and see that, in fact, they're the only ones, because of all the protection that they've gotten, that they're actually increasing in population. And they've gone up from that 200 and something that I knew when I first started there, to now, you know, with the gorillas that are the mountain gorillas that are in Uganda, in the Bwindi impenetrable forest. And then you look just to the south in the Virunga ranges. There's a total of, we're in and around 1,300 currently. That's a significant increase. Now, it's a fraction of what probably was originally there, but it's up from 250, let's say. So that's pretty significant. But then the next question becomes, what do you do about these gorillas that are trapped on islands? They're in
Mhm.
they're biological islands that, they
Mhm.
could be sitting in the middle of the Atlantic. You could, for all intents and purposes, you could take the Virungas and drop it in the middle of the Atlantic. You could take Bwindi impenetrable forest and drop it in the middle of the Pacific. Those gorillas have nowhere to go. Surrounding them are millions of people Those those nearly 3 billion people I spoke of, many of them surround these exact places. And so the numbers have dropped. And so going back to the origins of your question is like this Anthropocene, the influence that we see, climate change. You're talking about the Virungas go up to 10, 11,000 feet in the heart of the tropics. I mean, I've seen it when I was living and working there. I saw it snow up there. Nobody thinks about it snowing on the equator,
Mm-hmm.
but there are trees now up there that are struggling to have seedlings. Climate change is pressing down from the top, and populations are pressing up from the bottom, and they're sandwiching these gorillas in the middle. And they're doing it it's a more visual and dramatic way there. If I showed you a picture of the Virungas from a drone, or even from a distant hillside, you'd see it's almost like somebody took a razor blade and just cut around the edge of the park. It's agriculture right up to the boundary of the park,
Mm-hmm.
right? And now in many places, there's a big stone wall that's just, stones from the fields to keep the elephant. There are forest elephants there. So it's to keep the elephants, but the gorillas, of course, can just hop over the stone wall and eat your sugar cane or whatever. But that wall is at about 9,000 feet. Well,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't invite anybody to go back and look at a National Geographic from about 1990. It's either 92 or 94, or excuse me, 72 or 74. And it shows a picture of Dian Fossey taking this long line of porters to walk up to her research camp at Karasoke.
Mm-hmm.
They have to cross all this forest, go through this valley of forest and up onto the mountains. If you look at it now, that's all agricultural fields, all up the side of the mountain to 9,000 feet. So these
Mm-hmm.
animals have been trapped on these islands. They have nowhere to go. And that's repeated in a much less visually dramatic way across equatorial Africa, across Borneo, um, and across a lot of landscapes on this planet. So yeah, I mean, we need to be looking at them and looking the at disease transfer. I mean, again, you know, the thing about going back to why we chose apes as a focal species to talk about and to get our conservation efforts out. You often hear, they're 97, 98% us. And many of the guests that we have on our podcast, Talking Apes, are talking about the behavioral things that we're discovering about, chimps. There's somebody there at St. Andrews University in the UK, Kat Hobater, who's amazing at talking about her work in Uganda, and in a place called Budongo Forest, and she and her PhD students looking at all these amazing behaviors that chimps do. And what we're beginning to see is how much they are like us. It's way beyond that 98% DNA. And so what do we have to learn from them about who we are and what we are on this planet and our needs, and that from just sitting and watching them,
Mm-hmm.
and so that's, I think, where apes become so critical, and it's why they're so important in this whole push of the Anthropocene to take them into account and think about what's happening to them as a mirror held up to ourselves. There's a great story, and I might mess up a couple of the details, but the first chimp that came to the UK came to London Zoo
Mm-hmm.
back in the 1800s, and there was a lot of excitement about seeing this, and it was on display, and so they made a big event, and Queen Victoria came down and she saw it, and she then turned away almost immediately, and people were like, "Oh crap, did we do something wrong? Have we, pissed off the
Mm-hmm.
queen?" And she said something to the effect of, "I looked at it and it looked too much like me. It looked too much like a human." And
Mm-hmm.
that bothered her. That
Yep.
we And so what is it that bothered her? Did it bother her that it looked too much like us, or that we had put a sentient being, of course, at that point, they weren't using that term, but that we'd put this sentient being behind bars
Mm-hmm.
and looking into those eyes. And I think that's what we have to turn around and do. We need to do today. We need to look into those eyes and go, what are we doing to
Hmm.
its environment? Because that's a reflection of us.
Hmm. And I think that goes for all nature. I think it's something that like the apes are the easy kind of relatable one, but it was the classic modern picture I saw the other day when I went out for a walk just along to a local shop to pick up something for dinner, and the classic picture of family walking through the park, surrounded by birds, surrounded by things, surrounded by all sorts of wonderful like spring flowers were popping up, all sorts of wonderful thing. Baby in buggy on phone in front of face, mum pushing buggy, texting, dad walking behind mum, also out playing on something on phone. Not taking in anything around them, not taking any of the wildlife, the fact that they were in this beautiful green space, not kind of like connecting with nature in any way. And it's kind of this, yeah, I think, yeah, we do need to have this moment of let's stop and look and take a moment to appreciate what's there and really understand what's there and see what we can do about it. And I guess,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's we just had a guest on our podcast. His name is Carl Safina. He's an
Hmm.
amazing writer, and he's written several books, but three most recent books that we discussed on the podcast, and they and he describes in the first of those uh, books, he describes it as what he was trying to do was if he had arrived here in a spaceship and he stepped
Hmm.
out, what does this planet look like? To
Hmm.
look at it through fresh eyes and look at the species that are here and how they relate and who they are to themselves, not just,
Hmm.
we tend to be very anthropocentric or homocentric when we look at other things on the planet, especially
Hmm.
other species. So we always like, why, is my dog happy? What we're really asking is that dog, do I think it's happy? And is it happy to see me? Not what does happiness mean to a dog?
Yeah.
We're not thinking about its happiness from its perspective. And then so you expand that to other species. What does that mean to an elephant? What does that mean to a dolphin? And the three recent books he did look at that. They look at the world through that other lens of
Hmm.
what does it mean to be it?
Hmm.
What does it mean to be it in its terms? Because it's only when we start thinking that way that we, I think, get off our phones and we start looking at the world around us
Hmm.
and start crafting it in such a way that it engages us in a different way of thinking and perceiving the world. And that influences it comes in a million different ways. I mean, think about how many of us, I was not that long ago in Toronto, Canada, and the freeways there are like 10 lanes wide of people commuting
Hmm.
in and out of the city, and they're almost all one person per in the car, and they're all probably listening. Well, hopefully they're listening to our podcast, but they're they're listening to whatever they're not in their moment, because their moment is in this concrete layered
Hmm.
traffic influenced space. But at the same time, we also create all of our other spaces so that we don't engage. I mean, you think about
Hmm.
walking to, you walk to a neighborhood park where you live. You walk there and there's a park bench.
Hmm.
That park bench will undoubtedly face the sidewalk or the street out from the park. It doesn't face into the park. That park bench is probably only big enough to put a man, a woman, and two children can sit on that bench.
Hmm.
It's not built in a circle for a community of people to gather and talk to one another. It's not, like I said, it's not built facing into the park so that you see the nature of the park, the reason we made the
Hmm.
park, the reason
Yeah.
we kept it from being a concrete blob. It's a lot of conservation begins at home, and it begins in the miracle of the life we see in front of us. I mean,
Mhm.
again, I've been super fortunate to go off on all these places around the planet, but I keep a log of birds that land in my backyard every single day. I'm fortunate that the studio I'm talking to you from, where all my film editing and all of that, our staff is scattered around the world, but my studio's here, so I get up and I commute 6 to 8 feet,
Mhm.
and I go to work every day. But I get up to make a new cup of tea or whatever it is, and I keep a running checklist of all the birds. On
Mhm.
average, there's this time of year because it's winter, and there's a few more because they come to the feeders and things. But we have 18 to 21 species a day in the backyard, plus a couple of predators. A couple of Cooper's hawks and stuff make sorties through and try to
Mhm.
get breakfast or dinner. But it's an amazing living world, and I have friends that will come over, and we've redone the back of the house, and it's all glass, and it looks out into these gardens. And we live in an urban, we're in the heart of Portland, Oregon, on the west coast of the U.S. We're in the
Mhm.
city, um, but we've crafted the yard in plantings that are native to this zone, so they don't require as much maintenance. They're native to in some degree to the birds that need to be here and the other things. We have
Mhm.
baby skunks that come through the yard in the spring and all that stuff. And they'll walk up and they'll look out these glass windows and they'll see all this life and they just go, "Wow, what is I mean, it's just craziness." I mean, there's I think we're at 17 species this morning, and but that includes probably about 150 birds total. So there's like 150 birds
Mhm.
flying in and out of all of the stuff in the backyard. Do you I mean, it's like we can recognize males and females of specific species. We can recognize individuals now, and it's
Mhm.
just paying attention.
Mhm.
And it brings there's other than the food, that we buy and maybe
Mhm.
binoculars and a bird book, that joy comes every day free.
Mhm. Yep. And it's something that anybody who is lucky enough to have a green space or a garden are a bit have that ability to do, and it's yeah, it's one of those things that I feel like I feel like what was the statistic I saw? I'm trying to remember it. It's one of those ones where a lot of people will be like, well, having a bird feeder or encouraging nature in your garden probably doesn't make that much of a difference because it's that individualistic thinking. But it's one of those ones that I saw recently a statistic that was something ridiculous, like 100,000 or I think it was more than that, 500,000, something ridiculous number was the number of front gardens in the UK that had been concreted over or paved over within the last decade or something. And it becomes that ridiculous thing of like, well, if each of those one individuals had made that choice to invest in something like a bird feeder or kind of a bird bath or something, just some natural some plants from the local area to kind of for the birds to kind of nest and hide in, it just yeah, it does go to make it does yeah, make a difference. It does make a huge difference. um
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
we know globally that bees are
Hmm.
in trouble. Honeybees are in
Yep.
trouble. They're
Hmm.
they're critical, well, and other species of bees, but let's just take honeybees for a moment.
Hmm.
Critical pollinators. There's no mystery to this. We're
Yep.
wiping them out with a lot of the fertilizers and the pesticides we use and put on our crops. And so where are they going to go if they don't have
Hmm.
at least have these neighborhood gardens to go
Yep.
to? And so it's birds. I
Hmm.
mean, we're lucky enough that we do have a ravine a couple of blocks away. It's a big ravine, and then it goes down through a bit of a it's now been turned into some warehouse, industrial warehouse and stuff. It was
Hmm.
wetlands and then goes to a river. And so we have that ravine. We have great horned owls. We have coyotes. We have, there's other things. So we'll see them
Hmm.
occasionally in the neighborhood as well. And, we're lucky to have all that stuff. But also below that, it's again like taking, gorillas and orangutans. These birds are sort of at the top. Below them are butterflies and dragonflies and
Hmm.
bees and ants, and I mean all these things that are critical to this that overused word, web of life, but it's true.
Mhm.
And what if we go back to that idea of the Anthropocene, what we've been doing for the last 10,000 years is just snipping at the threads of that web.
Yeah.
And people often ask me in when I do a public lecture or something, they'll ask me, well, what can I do? And I, I I'm prepared for it now, and I pull up a slide, and it shows this little cartoon character and a giant red button, and he's just, like, so excited to just hit the giant red button, and I run the little animation, and it goes boing, and it's this, and I said, "That's the problem. We all want that. We all want you want me to tell you where's that big red button I hit and make all of this work? All of this will
Yeah.
be fixed." There was nobody 10,000 years ago with a big red button that they hit and changed it to be like it is today. It
Mhm.
was a billion little red buttons that everybody pushed every single day that
Mhm.
created where we are today. It was it was, you know, millions and millions of people doing slash and burn agriculture and like termites eating away at these forests, planting their crops, bigger crops. Now I can sell more. Now I can sell them down there. I need to build a ship to send the crops overseas.
Mhm.
Now we're moving during this Anthropocene, we have moved more genetics around this planet. We just saw a huge consequence of it called COVID-19.
Mhm.
But we are now moving genetics on a daily basis all over this planet.
Mhm.
So much of it is unseen. Our bodies are walking laboratories of viruses and bacteria, and we're moving. Every plane we get on, you get in a plane from London, I get in a plane from US. We cross the Atlantic, and we take all of that ecosystem with us.
Mhm.
And both of us are just coming off of colds.
Yeah.
That's a rhinovirus. It's rhinovirus A, B, and C. We get on a plane, we take it with us. We share that rhinovirus with someone else, and then someone else, and then it mutates, and it becomes a different beast altogether on this planet. And so when we think about the Anthropocene, and I think when we think about conservation, it's more than just saving elephants. It's more than just saving
Mhm.
gorillas. It's more than just saving, the Bali myna or a pangolin. It's
Mhm.
we we need to think about it in that way. And I was writing the intro to your podcast that I did with you a couple of weeks ago, and in part of that intro, I talk about that the podcast is going to be talking to you about conservation and the conservation of little creatures and the conservation of these sort of unknown bits and pieces of our planet. And I was at a conference a few years ago, and at which it was a biodiversity environmental conference, and in one of the sessions, they had somebody on who said, I want you to take the next 15 minutes and scribble down your definition for conservation.
Mhm.
A couple of key words. What does conservation mean to you? And then everybody kind of rejoined and just started raising hands and shouting out what they had written down. And they were writing them on giant whiteboards and projecting it up so everybody could see it. There were probably 120 to 150 people in the room.
Mhm.
Not one single definition of conservation was the same. And that's what I think we have to realize is that when we start talking about things like conservation, there are multiplicity of ideas and influences and perspectives that come to it, and they're all valid. And they all come through your original that lens that you developed from a child on up, that's been influenced by your education, by the food you eat, by the people that you associate with, by the place you live. And that view of conservation is going to be totally different for somebody who lives in the Congo Basin or lives in Madagascar or lives in, you know, Eastern Siberia or India or wherever, right? Or even down the street from where you live. But somehow we have to I liken it to what one of my board members said. He said, "What you're trying to do is for people who understand what an amoeba looks like. It's this, it's this creature that it's constantly on the move. It's constantly flexing its boundaries, right? This little microscopic thing." And he said, "What you're really doing is you're trying to teach the world what an amoeba looks like. It's this gigantic, gigantic continental size amoeba. And the problem is that at any one point, what you see isn't the amoeba. It's that tiny little peephole that you're looking through at. And what we need to do is get enough people that we trust and understand that their people is just their people and surround the amoeba. And all of us periodically shout what we see. And
Yeah.
that collective vision is what conservation is on this planet. And it includes human diversity, and it includes, social justice, and it includes gender equity, and it includes all of that. All of that. It's not just saving a little patch of rainforest. Because it all makes up this thing called the amoeba. But the reality is, and this is the hard part for the human brain, which is so linear. And talking to
Mm.
so many of the guests that have worked like with ape brains and things, one of the challenges with our brains is they're very, very linear. We have trouble thinking in a circular way. And that's why climate change is such a difficult concept, because climate change isn't a thing. It's a bunch of things that are constantly influencing one another and shifting the thing that we're looking at and trying to understand what it will be. And every time we think we know what it will be, there's a new influence that we didn't count on, or it was more of it than we thought. And and then all of a sudden it changes, and we have to just at some point become more accepting of that change and realize that it might take us standing around that giant amoeba, and we have to set up a regular interval at which we all shout what we see. It isn't
Mhm.
just shout it and then go away for 10 years.
Yeah. And it's not shout it. And if you're in the UK or the US or wherever it is, your microphone's slightly louder than everybody else's. That's the other, like, yeah, making
Exactly.
sure everybody has the same platform, the same place to be, the same space to shout, this is our perspective, this is what's happening, this is, yeah. And that's it's a really, it's such a strong image. That's a really good way of trying to explain it. I really, really like that. And I'd never heard it explained like that before. So that's, yeah, yeah, it was basically what I was trying to articulate when I was on your show, but you've put it in a much more beautiful way. So if anyone listened to that and has now found their way here, that's what I meant. Perfect. Um,
I'll credit you.
yeah.
I'll credit you with that.
No, that's it's a really, like, interesting kind of, like, yeah, a really great kind of point and a really interesting thing to have talked about. And I think quite a, like, interesting, like, it's one of those problems that I think is unsolvable by one person, but by everyone going away and thinking about it, I think hopefully will prompt little changes, which will hopefully prompt bigger changes and bigger changes and bigger changes. And, like, so interesting.
Well,
I
yeah, sorry. No, I was just going to say, well, it kind of goes back to that big red
mhm,
button.
mhm,
We it was all these tiny little buttons that we pushed. And so to finish that story that I was saying, so people ask me that, and I say, well, what you really need to do is quit pushing buttons. Just stop. Just stop. You know, we I can show you 1,000 different scenarios in which if we just quit touching a landscape, it actually recovers. And the population of bees recover, and the population of birds recover, and just stop. And that is the
yeah,
hardest thing for humans to do, is to think, just stop. Just think about 5 things that you do every day that has an impact that eventually will be negative. Just stop doing them. Find an alternate, just simply stop. But that we always want to fix things by doing something. Change only
Yeah.
comes when we actively get our hands on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Change sometimes can be amazing if we don't do anything.
Mm-hmm. That's something that, yeah, I guess because when I went to uni to do conservation studies as this course, like when I went for it was kind of learning that lesson of, I was speaking to one of my supervisors one day, and she was talking about how she was working on kind of it was in a national park in Africa, and there was a type of antelope, there was also elephants, and there was not enough water. And the kind of options are then in front of you of like, well, do you put more, because there was already water pumps into the park to provide additional water. Do you add more water pumps? Do you do something else? Do you try and move the animals? Do you do this, that, the next thing? Or do you do nothing? And like that option of do you do nothing is someone who like is interested in animals and is interested in making sure welfare is high, and like making sure everybody is, like, all of the animals and plants and everything is catered for in that environment. That you never want to be the person who says, well, oh, let's just do nothing and see what happens. So it's an interesting one of like, even when you like, it's trying to find like, yeah, everybody just stop sometimes, think before doing. And it's a really powerful message, I think. A really, really powerful message. And like the end of every episode, I usually ask people for advice, but I know to avoid that now because I feel like it's not what I need to be doing. But I guess like it does lead on to another kind of question and point that kind of I wanted to ask you about. And like, I think we've talked for a long time now about things that are really like important, really serious. It's not to diminish the kind of like importance of them, but it is to turn the conversation to kind of that hopeful narrative and just like that inspirational narrative. And I suppose the question then is, what is it? What are the things that you've experienced that kind of like give you the hope or give you the inspiration to keep going and keep fighting? Because you haven't given up clearly on like this kind of the planet and making sure that it and the great apes and all of these things have protection. So what are those things that give you hope and inspire you to kind of keep going? Hello, sorry to interrupt, but as always, when you get two podcasters in one room, we talk for far too long. So I've made the choice to split this episode in two, and next week, Gerry will be back to tell us what gives him hope and a whole lot more. We talk about his favourite underappreciated species and some of the other things that keep him inspired and, yeah, keep him going. So it's a really good time. So please, please, please come back for that. So you don't miss out, of course, make sure to subscribe, leave us a nice review. You can follow us on all of your podcast streaming platforms as well as on social media. So you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, at Pangolin Podcast on all of them. So go and check those out. And of course, while you're down in the description of this episode looking at all of those links and finding out where you're going to follow us, you can also check out Talking Apes and all of Gerry's incredible work through the links that you'll find down there as well. So please do that. Show him some love. The podcast that he runs is amazing. Everything he does is really interesting. So yeah, go and give him a follow as well. But yes, with all of that said, I will leave you because yeah, that's really all I have to say for this week. We've been here for over an hour already, guys. I'm sorry to cut you off, but an hour a week is all we can manage. So, thank you so much for listening. Thank you all for your continued support. Thank you, Gerry, for appearing on the show. And until next time, love you all and goodbye.